these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Every revolution begins the same way. Radicals divide and conquer society. Envy and hatred are a communicable virus and secondary infection, and they spread among the most immunocompromised. That is, the unhumans divide cultures into categories, then infect perceived allies who have the greatest grievances over alleged unfairness, actual inequality, or both. Historically, that separation has been done by economic class, but more recently by race and gender, and by both immutable and mutable characteristics. After the dividing comes the conquering. That's a quote from Jack Posobiec's book, Unhumans, The Secret History of Communist Revolutions and How to Crush Them. I think that'll be the most interesting part. Jack, welcome back.
Congressman, thanks so much for having me back on.
So you were on episode 201. To discuss China, because you have some history in China, which I think is super interesting. You speak Mandarin. You lived there with the Commerce Department, working for the right.
I was
Chamber.
Close. I was with I had a job with the AmCham, so American Chamber of Commerce,
Yeah.
and so not Commerce Department. Although obviously there's a lot of overlap there, and it's a small kind of delegation of Americans. So actually we were co-located in the same building as some of the offices of the Commerce Department. So yeah, there are times where it feels like you're kind of working together there in Shanghai.
Yeah, fascinating experience. I'm pretty sure, like most members of Congress, actually, I think we're sanctioned by China, so I'll never see the place. What can I do?
Well, what's interesting is though, honestly, Congressman, that, and this gets into, obviously we have a chapter on the Chinese Communist Revolution. We talk about that in the book, but something that was so interesting that when I would be over there, and I do tell the story all the time about, and this is actually it's not like a bipartisan statement, but it's sort of one of those both things where we would have delegations of governors, business leaders, CODELs coming through Shanghai all the time. And what was so interesting to me is that, and this is going back, it was 2006 to 2008 when I was there. So, almost 20 years ago now. But what always happened was, and there was this idea that, if we open up to China, that they'll become more like us. They'll become more open. They'll become more democratic. They'll become more economically liberal. Now, obviously, that hasn't happened. But here's the interesting thing that did happen is, and I would see this, and they would come through, and they would always go down the street, and they had this place called the Shanghai Planning Museum. And at the time, actually, the party secretary of the city of Shanghai was a guy by the name of General Secretary Xi Jinping, who I think most people have heard of at this point. And he would not always meet with them, but usually that would be kind of worked into one of the delegation's itineraries. But they always go to this city planning museum, they called it, but it was always for where the future plans of the city would be laid out. And they talk about their maglevs and their high-speed trains, and we're going to be building this, and everybody knows China loves their mega projects. They've been doing them for 2,000 years. And so I remember whenever the Americans would say, well, what about the people who live in this area? Or do you ever have to worry about, historic building sites or anything like that? And the party members would just kind of look at them and go, what about the people who live there? What about the rights of anybody? What historic? Who cares? And it was almost like, and I speak Mandarin, so I could certainly hear what they were saying in Chinese as well. They'd say like, what a silly question by these Americans. And so I oftentimes wonder if that's where a lot of this technocratic thinking that sometimes has seeped into the United States kind of comes from, because you go over to other parts of the world that don't have our system, that defends individual rights at its core, and you realize that there's a lot of power there. There's a lot of power that's imbued in those commissions, that's in those parties, in those leaders, to say, hey, we can do whatever we want. And then, of course, in California, they try to build their high-speed rail, and I think they're like 10 billion sunk in, and not a single person has traveled anywhere on this thing, or something like that. But you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That it's it's
oh yeah, no, it definitely affects the
like
thinking.
We've almost become more like them than they've become more like us.
Yeah, I think that's always been true of American Democrats, American leftists, whether they're communists or not is a separate question, but they definitely see value in that central planning. they definitely see like there's like some kind of greater good, and that you have to sacrifice personal rights for some kind of greater good, and that if you just had a little bit more power, you could do a little bit more good for people. And I mean, that's kind of so this is getting back to your, but I mean, this is kind of a theme throughout your book where that sentiment could be a pre-planned strategy, right? We're going to make them think this, and then we're going to make them think this, and then we're going to get this much power. We're going to do this with that much power, and then we're going to keep going along those lines. It could be. I don't attribute that much intelligence or strategic thinking to a lot of people on the left in politics. I think more likely I think it's a very natural human sentiment. Like
Yes.
they have an oversized sense of compassion in many ways, and it can be, and its compassion can be oversized. I mean, you can have too much of it, and there can be fallout accordingly. And then it's like a stepping stone. It's like a progression where, okay, well, we need this to do this. Well, it didn't work out so well. Why didn't it work out so well? Well, because it just never works out so well. Okay, well, we need a little bit more power, and then we can do a little bit more good. So we just got to change this. The problem is we didn't go far enough, and then boom, you have communism. Not boom, but over the course of maybe a few years. And I noticed that's probably a theme in a lot of the cases that you looked at. So you look at cases from China to France to Russia. My first question though is like, why the term unhumans? What do you mean? What are unhumans?
Well, so it's actually a verb. And this is something that we find members of the far left and communists and their associated brethren, and we all know the laundry list of, anarchists and anarcho-syndicalists and anarcho-socialists and blah, 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 blah. Everything that it comes under. But, you can really wrap them up under the umbrella of the far left. And what we say is that it's a verb that is what they do to their opponents. They deny the human rights of anyone who's standing in their way because, as you say, it's this sort of pathological altruism that they have. And so they believe that they're fighting for utopia. They want this utopia to occur. And, anyone who's in their way, well, we just got to get rid of that negative sentiment, that toxic sentiment. They view this. By the way, someone just responded. There was the chief AI researcher at Meta just sent this public message on X to Elon Musk, who was describing his newfound political beliefs as a mind virus, saying that you have a virus. This must be taken into account. You must be cured. You must be cleansed of your virus. It's this really long post on X, where she's sort of psychologically psychoanalyzing him. I don't even know if they know each other. And she's saying that, you must have something wrong with you to believe these crazy things that you do about allowing for freedom of speech, standing up against wokeness. How could anyone possibly have this stuff unless something is wrong with them? And so you can start to see that along this path, that's where they're denying the individual rights, the individual agency, certainly the private property rights of others. And so to deny all of that in together, it essentially denies your humanity. It denies the fact that we are all individuals with certain human rights. And, people say, well, isn't that equality? I say, well, equality is an interesting subject, and it's a complicated subject, because when we say equality of value, right, I value someone else as another individual, but that doesn't always mean what the left, of course, comes for it to mean, that we're going to value that person's, their work output or their performance. No, that's based on merit. That's based on quality. And so I think that there's been, and this is something I've been sort of teasing out as we write the book out here, they say, well, if you don't believe a person's equal, then, do you believe that person should be compensated? We hear this in the, discussions of the gender wage gap and all these other gaps that they throw up out there. I think they make up like half of them. And so there's a tension between the ideas of equality and quality. And in the idea that, yes, a person's worth is equal. And actually, we throw it back on them throughout the book. Myself and my co-author, Joshua Lysek, who did a fantastic job working on this, is to say that you are the ones who actually don't view people equally. You are the ones who are constantly calling for people to be banned, to be shunned, to be harassed in public. The ones who certainly we saw the responses to President Trump's assassination attempt, where 30% of the people said it didn't happen, or people were saying that they wish that it had been successful, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the type of ideology specifically we're talking about, where they've decided to no longer view their political opponents as someone who should be dealt with rationally or reasoned with, but just people who should be removed.
Yeah, and that gets to another question of, is somewhere tucked away in communist history some people that actually do believe in some kind of utopia? Like they really believe it can work. I mean, there might be, I don't know if they're out there, and I'm curious in your research on this subject, what you conclude. It does seem like the modern day version of it is really just about inter-party or just beating the other team, politically speaking, by whether it's dehumanizing them or just or creating narratives, which they do quite well. We've seen that in the last few days. The memory holding of something like the borders are for Kamala Harris, really fascinating. Saw another video of the new buzzword being weird. I mean, clearly this was like calling Republicans weird. I mean, it's a very simple thing, but I think it's obviously focus group tested. I think it can ring true with a lot of moderates, especially sometimes the way some of our people act. So I get that. And it's clever. But what's weird is when I see a video of all of these different newscasters actually saying it just within the last week. It's really impressive. But I guess
that. But by the way, my one of the things that we threw out there, and I just started this kind of on Twitter, really this afternoon, and is so the counter to that for at least JD Vance is to say, well, is he weird? And whoa, hold on a second. JD Vance is your typical Midwestern suburban dad, and he's got that Midwest dad energy. So people are posting memes now. This is taking off where it's, and this is, by the way, this is the way you respond with information warfare. You've always got to have these counter tactics. So you spin it to say, is he weird? No, he's goofy. Right? No, he's goofy, and goofy is an acknowledgement, but it's also an understanding and fitting it into the archetypal character of, a Hank Hill or the Midwestern,
Right.
the Midwestern suburban dad. Yeah. Does he wears, jean shorts and it's got his socks tied, pulled up tight, and he rides a, riding mower, and he's got his New Balances on, and, whenever one of his friends comes in, he goes, "Hey, there's that guy. They'll let anybody in here." One of those memes. And so this is totally taking off because you've got to learn, and this kind of gets into the countering narrative of how to do this stuff. You just use mockery. So you use mockery, you use humor, you respond with that rather than, the anger or trying to explain yourself, which is what they want. They want you to sit there and be defensive and responsive and reactive and defending yourself all the time. "Oh, I didn't mean this." And, we aren't associated with that. They want you on the response mode. You just got to take their meme and laugh about it and turn it into your own meme and throw it right back at them.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense, especially in this case. I personally think beating the left is super easy. I think we make it a lot harder than it is.
It is,
but and a lot of it is mockery. I mean, I think one of the more successful counter punches, I think, in our modern time has been the Babylon Bee. Just using very clever satire to expose the ridiculousness of some of the left's beliefs. I want to get back.
They have over there at the Bee, by the way. It's incredible. Like, something will happen, and really I just heard about it, and then I look over. They must have like a 24/7 operation or something, because they'll have a joke about the article up, and I'm on Twitter like way more than anyone should be. Totally acknowledge this, but there are worse addictions to have out there. I will also respond with that. And I don't drink, I don't smoke, but yeah, that is my one addiction. But those guys, they will have a response up making fun of whatever just happened, like within minutes of me actually figuring it out.
Yeah, I mean, before you've even had a second to be creative about it, they've got it written down and published online. Okay, back to the kind of intellectual history here, because I think that's more interesting about what you've written. You do a variety of case studies. So whether comparing France and China and Russia, I'm not sure what others, but you also describe something called a communist reality. So And that kind of gets to the question I asked earlier, like what is it? What have you found in your research? Are there those utopianists that really do believe that this actually is the right thing, and they're like their hearts are truly in it?
So it kind of depends on what level in the hierarchy you're talking about. And funny enough, of course, communism bills itself as a totally flat ideology. It's actually one of the most hierarchical ideologies and movements out there. And so one of the first things that we do is to try to explain that communism itself isn't as much of a coherent ideology. And by the way, if you've ever argued with a communist or like a Reddit leftist, you know that they're not incoherent from one day to the next. I mean, you might get them to agree to something, and then the next day they like forget that you even had the conversation or you made the point, and they'll just go right back to their old talking points. Or they'll say, "No, that never happened. No, I always said this. Police are always racist." Like one of these things they're just constantly saying over and over and over, and you ask them for data to back it up, and it's all over the place. So we would describe communism more as a tactic. And we explained how it's been used historically, essentially to rile up the masses against whatever regime, government, system, society, country, you named a few. We also do, we cover Spain, we cover France, which are, I think, instances of communism that people have heard of, or France, of course, that's pre-Marx, so we call that but it's so much along the exact same lines of a leftist revolution that you have to include it. It's clearly a proto-Marxist revolution.
Well, I mean, a lot of writers sort of use for the French Revolution as the beginning. I mean, it's the beginning of the communist movement, because it was based on this
and we
emotion and this like
Paris
egalitarianism.
the Olympics right now.
Yeah, and we also shouldn't act all that surprised about it, because I mean I don't know if it's a joke, but...
and actually a lot of the readers, and the book's done very well, and probably even better after doing this podcast, but that people will come up to us and say, you know what, this totally fits into the lens that you guys put out in the book, because
they took down Christ's altar in Notre Dame and replaced it with the altar of reason or something. And I was like, there's this idea that you could, the cult of reason. It was this idea that you could just start from day one. Like, look, we have brains. The idea, it's like the Tower of Babel, really. It's like we have the intellect. We can do this. We don't need God. And let's see what happens. And then they have a lot happened, and it didn't go so well.
This is something that we carry on and we track throughout each of these revolutions. And I know we're jumping around, but it's good, because the attack on Christianity, specifically the targeting of Christianity more than almost any other group, is something that we carry out across each of these revolutions. We go through a bunch in the Cold War as well. We get into some of the Third World revolutions, Latin America, South America, Africa, and the targeting of Christians, specifically even in China, which is not a country that's known for widespread Christianity, but certainly had Christians and had churches and had missionaries and numerous communities where some Christianity had been thriving at the time. These are almost immediately targeted in generally the first phases of any one of these leftist takeovers. And so getting back to your initial...
It makes sense as to why, though, right? I mean, it makes a lot of sense.
Of course it makes sense.
Because Christianity is the first...
a separate belief system.
Well, but not just that. Christianity is the first time, it was the first time that you got to hold God within you, and that you didn't have to go to a higher priest or a temple, some kind of elder, to gain access to that higher power. That's the best thing about Christianity, and it empowers everybody. It's humanity's first step into what we would consider true equality, like the value of a person, right? The divinity lives within you, and you can access that through your own unique relationship to God. And so that's a really dangerous thing if you're trying to engage in this kind of communist collectivism. Of course you have to stamp it out. The last thing I'll say about the French Olympics was it really sucks that they did that, because there was a lot of other really cool shit. I mean, they had like the heavy metal band playing on the side of a building and fire and shit coming out. It was awesome. So like, why screw it up? Like, why screw it up?
And I was actually having a conversation with someone, totally offline about this, and it sucks for the athletes too, because you're
just sucked into it.
Regular athletes, where you're you're practicing so hard, you're training so hard, you're working your entire life basically at that point. I mean, these, the athletes go to the Olympics are quite young, and now it's just overshadowed in the public mind by this thing. So I've been kind of looking to see if there's any one of those, I don't know, great American stories that we can, I think they got the bronze in the gymnastics yesterday.
Yeah, that was pretty huge.
pop out.
We've been doing really well, and a lot of these there's like a dozen athletes from my district. So like it's
Oh,
been we've been watching it anyway. I mean, like the athletes are doing their thing and we should support them. But yeah. Anyway, let's back to
But actually, Congressman, that's actually it ties directly into what we're talking about, because this is an institution, and so whether or not I'm not sure exactly if the IOC signed off on that or how much that was the French host committee. I'm guessing it was probably more of the French host committee. But it also goes to show you that the infiltration of institutions is also something that is done by and large by every single leftist revolutionary movement since time immemorial. And of course, just like 250 years ago, the very first one that we get into in the book happened in Paris, France. Once again, we have the infiltration of organizations and institutions of power in Paris, France.
Yeah, and I get this question from constituents all the time. I'm sure you get this question when you're doing speaking events or whatever. How do we get them? How do we get our institutions back? And I'm like, man, there's no easy answer for that, because the reality is that conservatives self-select out of a lot of these institutions. They self-select out of institutions of learning and go into institutions of business. And even then, there's infiltration that occurs. Now, there's a long story behind how that happens, I suppose, but it's tough to march back through the institutions once they've been marched through. And in a way that was, frankly, quite organic. There are, of course, intellectuals that talk about marching through the institutions earlier in the 20th century. And, the Soviets were very good at their propaganda what's the word I'm trying to say? Recruit. I don't know why I couldn't think of the word recruit, but recruit does like thousands of communist sympathizers within the universities. I always say, like,
Well, actually, I would throw out. Right, you mean universities in the United States?
Yeah, I'm talking about the U.S. Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes, I was going to say, because funny enough, actually in Russia, when the Bolsheviks
tell us about how
over,
it happened there. Yeah.
It's really interesting, because something that we came out with was that the initial cadre of Bolsheviks, when they started taking over. So, people know the story. It's World War One. They knocked the Tsar out. They used the same tactics, grievance politics. Everything's the Tsar's fault. Join us, and we're going to have utopia. Join us, and everything's going to be great. We later found out that, of course, Lenin, they say, when he signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and gives this incredibly favorable terms to the Germans, and people at the time were saying, wow, this guy Lenin seems like a German agent. Of course, years later, we found out that he was being handed bags of money by the German government in order to do so, and had actually been sent on a train car across Switzerland by the Germans to go and initiate this revolution in Russia to knock the Tsar and knock the armies out, because the Germans didn't want to fight on two fronts. And so they, of course, later didn't do as well in the war.
I'm not sure that history is so well known. That's pretty interesting.
It's fascinating, and that's one of the things where it's just, this book, by the way, it's vignettes. We don't intend for this to be a comprehensive history book, but it is just sort of those interesting points to get into where we're telling the story of what happened. And then one of the first things I usually hear from people who have read the book at this point is they say, oh my gosh, I need to read a book on the Spanish Civil War now, or Orwell's got a great book on it, or, oh my gosh, I've got to read this. Sean McMeekin has got and he's got a whole series on Russian communism.
Was that Animal Farm? Was Animal Farm based on the Spanish Civil War?
It really interesting situation. So Animal Farm is the Bolshevik Revolution, but Orwell himself writes it after fighting in the Spanish Civil War. Mm-hmm. So people read Orwell. People kind of read Orwell backwards, because we read Animal Farm in middle school, if you're in a good school, or maybe like a charter school or something, private school. Yeah. You read Animal Farm, then high school. Hopefully, if you're still in a school that does serious work, you're reading 1984 in high school, mm-hmm. But then as an adult, I strongly recommend that people read Homage to Catalonia. And this was the book that he wrote in 1938, so a couple years after the Spanish Civil War ends, which he fought in himself, by the way, on the side of the socialists and the communists, but also he gets shot in the neck, by the way, on the front lines there. That George Orwell was almost killed on the front lines in the Spanish Civil War. But while he's holed up in the hospital, he starts reading newspapers. And he's reading the newspapers back from his home country of the UK, and he's reading. He says, "Wait a minute, this isn't what happened on the ground at all. This battle is the opposite of what happened in the battle, and this guy's got this wrong. And wait a minute, they're talking about a battle over here, but that battle never even happened." So he's kind of coming to consciousness about the fact that the media is lying to him and perhaps had sold him these false stories about this romantic fight for progress. And that's what he was fighting for, and goes over and joins. And he starts realizing, wait a minute, all of these people are lying to us about what's really going on. So he writes his book, Homage to Catalonia, which is the book that then sets up his career to later write 1984 and then to write Animal Farm. So it's kind of in reverse order from the way that we encounter typically Orwell as we're growing up, that once you're an adult, you've got to read that book to realize that the media gets stuff wrong. I'm sure you more than others would know about how the media gets war reporting completely wrong. And really the problem of what happens in this book, we're talking about almost 100 years ago that he finally woke up to it. He said, look, you got millions of people that are reading these newspapers thinking that they know what's going on, but they're actually more ill-informed than if they hadn't read the newspaper at all.
Some of our best thinkers were prior Marxists, like Thomas Sowell comes to mind.
That's right.
I know two other people who've been shot right through the neck and been totally fine. It was on both on just one deployment. I mean, what is it with the neck? Like, don't aim at the neck, I guess, you'll be fine.
By the way, on that topic, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, since the door is open, about this idea of the shrapnel theory, the Trump shrapnel theory that Chris Wray put out, and the glass of the teleprompter. Even though, of course, you could just look in the images and see the teleprompters were not hit at all.
It's a verifiable fact, so I don't know. I mean, it's what's weird to me now. To be fair to Ray, like, he's never said Trump wasn't shot. You know, like nobody has ever taken that position ever from the government side. That's a left-wing media like hoax that's been, I've never heard that from anybody. But what does shock me from the FBI and the Secret Service is they're just some of their inability to do basic public relations and either defend themselves or explain themselves, you know, because within days of that happening, I had Secret Service friends and some police friends who were like on the ground getting me all the details. I had all the details. I can tell you what happened and like where the fuck ups were, all of it. I don't understand why the director, and she should have stepped down because she's obviously not fit to lead that agency back to where it needs to be. Just because of what I'm saying, she couldn't answer really basic questions about what happened. Like, how do you not know? We know something happened to him because there was blood on his face right away. So like something happened. Now, you know, did it take a chunk of his ear off? Obviously not. You know, I don't freaking know. Like I'm not I haven't examined him. Maybe I'll talk to my friend Ronnie Jackson about it. But you know, I just don't know. I don't know why they can't give answers by this point. Obviously you would know if there was a teleprompter that had been shot by now. Like that would have been part of the detailed investigation.
I had a friend who was in the front row, and you know, he gave me photos within, I don't know, a couple of hours and you could see, and of course in the New York Times photos and a lot of famous photos that come out, if you look at the wider version of a lot of those pictures that we're getting are cropped. So the one, you know, with the fist in the air and stuff, that's cropped, but in the wider shots, because they didn't know that they were going to be filming that. So they were, you know, they had the camera settings for wide. You could see the teleprompters in every single one of the pictures that they were not hit. Also, we know obviously there were people in the crowd who were hit. One who, of course, lost his life. You know, it seems. I think
Christopher Wray. I think the FBI director is honestly just trying to. I think he's on our side more than he's on the crazy side here, because I think he's just trying to explain, like, look, something happened to Trump. obviously he was shot at and there was blood, so obviously something happened. And he's like, he's probably kind of in our position, like, I don't know how to explain why his ear heals that fast. Maybe he's fucking Wolverine. I don't know. But he did get shot. Like he was shot at. There was an assassination attempt. End of story. That's the part that matters.
He's definitely dodging bullets.
He's definitely dodging bullets, and he grabs his ear, and that's a
Literally
reactive. He grabbed his ear. He did like this, like something hit him. You know, like it's obvious, and only crazy people deny that. But I mean, and again, in the director's defense, I think they're so bad at answering questions. I'm like, can I please help you guys with PR? Like, because government agencies and corporations do the same thing. They always tend to think that less is more. And I'm like, no, it's not. And in really tense situations, you've got to explain. You've got to go into more detail. You've got to give more answers. Otherwise, people think you're hiding something. They stop trusting you. And if you don't know, say you don't know. That's okay too. But whatever it is you're doing it wrong.
But actually,
Lenin, sorry.
The point that I didn't finish, and that's on me because I totally digressed. But early on, after the Bolsheviks take over, this is so interesting. You actually see the professional classes throughout. So it's the Russian Empire at this time, and the professional classes turn against the Bolsheviks. So they quit because the Bolsheviks again took power through an armed coup so the Tsar drops. So there's two revolutions in Russia in 1917. The Tsar drops, he leaves, he hands it over to his brother. His brother says, hey, we're going to try some democracy thing. We're going to call it the provincial government. And this is going to be set up in the middle. And let's see if we can get some kind of, they already had sort of a basic parliament at this point, the same way the UK has one. And so they said, let's just turn this over, and provisional government. And it just doesn't work. And it's very moderate. This is the Mensheviks are a part of this that everybody knows about. And so Lenin and his guys say, no, we don't like this anymore. We're just going to overthrow it. So they lead an armed coup of the Winter Palace and some of the areas in St. Petersburg, Petrograd at the time, that were being used to host this provisional government. And right after that, the institutions of government, so your bureaucrats, like your Russian IRS, your Russian academy, they all turn against the Bolsheviks. They even get to the point where they won't give them access to the Russian treasury, and all the gold of the Russian Empire is there, the gold of the Tsars. You guys are a bunch of criminals. We're not going to give you any of this stuff. And this is where you start to get to the first purges, because it's those people who are directly targeted by the Bolsheviks to say, okay, well, we are the government now. We're telling you we're the government. And if you're not going along with us, now we're going to put you on show trial. Now you're going to be arrested. Now you're going to be hauled off to the gulags. And then once you do that a couple of times, the rest of them, basically fall in line. But it's interesting that when we look at the institutions, it wasn't a long march through the institutions. When the Bolsheviks took power, they just did it by force.
Yeah, it sounds that seems to have more parallels to the French Revolution than anything. Also very somewhat sudden, a lot of show trials by force. The question I wanted to ask was Marxism versus Leninism. Is there a difference, and how should we think about this?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, so there's and that's actually good, because that's a good a trivia question for folks. Once you read this book, you actually will be very easily able to explain the difference. Marxism, Leninism, even Maoism, which of course comes up later in the China chapter. And so it's pretty simple. And yeah, there's a lot of ideological thought process behind this, but I can break it down so easily. It's, hey, Intel guy, right? Be good, be brief, be gone. And so the idea is with Marxism, Marx believed in this natural progression of history, and that history would proceed from the feudal phase, so your monarchs, your kings and queens, etc., into a capitalist phase. And then from the capitalist phase, it would move into a socialist phase. And then a socialist phase would automatically move itself into this communist phase as the workers just demanded more rights and the workers rose up. And when you read the actual Communist Manifesto, it has this idea they call the progression of history. Lenin comes along and says, yeah, history doesn't seem like it's progressing fast enough for my purposes. Someone needs to move history along. And so what Lenin adds to it is this idea. And by the way, Eric Hoffer's done a lot of great work on this, called in his book True Believers, which he wrote back in the 1950s. And he was this sort of like a San Francisco longshoreman, working class guy who later becomes a philosopher and a professor. And he wrote this book that, look, the working class isn't going to sit around running actual revolutions because they're too busy working. They have jobs, they have families, they're not sitting around waiting to overthrow the government or something. And that's why typically when you see these revolutions, it's really done by like upper middle class, or more directly, the children of upper middle class societies. So not people who are in like the 1% per se, but if you look across a lot of these revolutions, that's what we see. Lenin, Chairman Mao himself was the son of a wealthy landowner. And so you see this kind of tendency play out. So Lenin said, we need people to teach the workers and drive the workers into revolution. And what we're going to call it is a vanguard, a revolutionary vanguard, or what he calls the vanguard of the proletariat. And what he does is he brings what he calls the urban proletariat together. And what he does is he uses these dregs of society. So people who, former criminals, folks who were in gangs, people who, for whatever reason, are pushed to the margins of society, and then brings them together in what you could call a coalition of the fringes. And this coalition of the fringes tactic, by the way, you can see endemic throughout all leftist politics even today. It's this idea of we're going to bring all these people together, not united by any real ideology other than the people who they oppose, the people who they hate. That's the thing that actually joins them all together. And so by increasing that number through something like, importing illegal immigrants, or
the weird,
whatever
what they call
be.
the red green alliance, the communists
Red Green Alliance,
with
creating
Islamists,
new
they shouldn't be
socialist.
together at all, but they're yeah.
Right, and this is what they're doing. They're using the Leninist tactic of the coalition of the fringes. So it's ironic when you say it, but they're increasing their fringes. So when you increase your fringes, you're actually increasing your leftist coalition. And of course, we see a lot of fractious infighting from these groups from time to time. Then in Maoism, Mao comes along and says, well, look, I don't have a lot of this urban proletariat stuff. I don't know, because he was dealing with a society that had been an imperial dynasty, and then he just had peasants throughout the countryside. And what he decided to do was recruit the peasants directly. And there's this sort of there's this story that I heard when I was in China. It's something that a Chinese professor told me once, and it's probably apocryphal, but supposedly that Mao. So the Germans funded the Soviets. The Soviets, of course, funded the CCP initially, and they're trying to push this idea of Leninism on them. And Mao says, look, this isn't working. And then he goes, look, these peasants are a bunch of potatoes, but if all I've got are potatoes, then I'm going to use potatoes. And he gets pushed. So he tries it at first, by the way. He tries it in Shanghai. But what the nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek does is they hire a bunch of the local gangs, the triads in Shanghai, and then use them to just start arresting and going to war with, like, they get the gangs to go to war against the communists and drive them out of Shanghai all the way across to Western China and the Western peasant fields and the farmlands. And this is what's called the Long March, by the way. That's where Marcuse gets the line, the Long March through the institutions. The original Long March was when Chairman Mao had gotten smashed in the 1920s in Shanghai, and then marched the entire Red Army, loses like 90% of it along the way, marches them all the way across to Western China. And he just builds up this massive peasant army that's like literally using pitchforks and torches at one point in the 1930s to fight the Civil War against the nationalists. So Maoism is the idea that you'll go directly to the workers, organize those revolutionary work cadres, and have actual workers just overthrow.
How did Mao like get them to want to rise up? I mean, was it what is he telling them? Like, what promise is he telling the peasants?
It's the same. It's all utopianism. It's every time it's utopianism, typically land reform. And when we hear land reform, it's tough for us to kind of grasp what that really means, because this idea of you owning your own land, it's something, it's a little bit different than the way we talk about it now. But I would say wealth distribution, phrases like reparations. So it just comes down to money. And so these guys have too much stuff.
Yeah.
And they have that stuff not because of their work or not because of their what their family's done or anything that they've been able to put into it. And by the way, some of these grievances we see throughout the book, a lot of the times these grievances are legitimate. Russians had serfdom, slavery existed in many of these societies. Being a peasant, it kind of sucked. And so one of the things that we put in terms of crushing it is, well, you let the air out of the bag. Teddy Roosevelt came in and was like, okay, let's not have this crazy, wholesale communist revolution in response to the industrial revolution, like we can see going on in Europe, and this was already getting going at this point. And this is where we get like a lot of our labor laws and some of this. Now, has a lot of that gone overboard? Sure. But that's sort of the point. You're releasing pressure from the system so that you don't actually.
Well, and you're also accurately assessing a proper grievance. I mean, it's it's not like there's not injustices. There are injustices, but you do have to analyze the injustice. Is it an injustice because life just isn't fair? Is it an injustice? Is it an unequal outcome because you didn't work as hard, or were you? Or this is the key question, and I think this is where like the American founding and protecting its ideals are so important. The key question is, did somebody infringe on your inalienable rights, your right to life, liberty, to own property, to work for a living, to earn your labor? Did someone infringe upon that? If the answer is yes, then you are owed something. But oftentimes, and especially when we generalize it to entire groups, the answer is very clearly no. And so like assessing the grievance accurately is so damn important. But then also having the proper solutions to rectify, because like in a lot of these countries, as you said, like the grievances seem pretty real. I think there's probably plenty of evidence to suggest that, this is the old world, by the way. I mean, this was common. I mean, it's the elites did infringe on what we would call inalienable rights of the people.
In the Constitution or in the Declaration, we have the list of grievances. It's right there. It's actually one of the things that led to our revolution. But and we've actually had some questions from people say, well, how come you didn't include the American Revolution in the book? I mean, that was certainly a revolution, right? And some people, especially if you're coming if you ever talk to British people about the American Revolution, they'll say right off the top, they'll say that was a liberal revolution. That was a liberal thing to do, because in the European version of conservatism means like monarchy. And so they have different definitions than I think we would. And one of the reasons that we said is exactly what you just put out there is, well, this was a revolution for the preservation of those individual rights, not just a revolution that overthrew one government or one monarch and instituted this widespread societal chaos that we saw in all of the other revolutions. That's the main difference, because in France, in Spain, in Russia, in China, and all the other ones we talk about, is you have the complete infringement of the rights by then the new government, which institutes themselves as sort of an inverse hierarchy replacing the previous hierarchy.
It's like it's fighting fire with fire, and this is getting back to our own modern politics. I point this out to people a lot, because we see the excesses of the left and people want to fight fire with fire. And I say, when's the last time you actually put out a fire with fire? You don't. You use water. And I think the American Revolution is the perfect example of that, where you have this infringement of basic human rights, as was basically normal throughout human history, up until the last couple hundred years when America decided to be America. But it was not fought with just another tyrannical revolution under the guise of equality for all. It was the first time we wrote down all the best ideas in history, defined equality as it should be, defined human rights as they should be, as negative rights, not positive rights. And that's another key difference, right, between the American Revolution and all these other revolutions. They're promising them positive rights, meaning like you're owed something. Yes. And negative rights mean that you own something. You own your own labor. You own your own time. You own your own property. You have a right not to be infringed upon. But that's different from saying you have a right to, say, free healthcare, because that involves taking something from somebody else. But that's the ultimate promise of the communists or the socialists, the leftists, or however we label
The
them.
Soviet Constitution had far more rights than our Bill of Rights. The Soviet Constitution was hundreds of pages long in all of the things that it guaranteed to the citizens. Now, whether or not those actually occurred, no, of course not. But again, what it did was it gave the government more power in order to control organizations and institutions. And what people have to understand, though, is that a lot of that talk and a lot of this ideology, it's just window dressing. It's just window dressing for the people who are running these operations to gain control of institutions, to gain control of governments, and in order to really punish, to seek these grievances out, to go after.
It's the quickest path. It's the quickest path because it's like it's time tested. And you write too that the potential for red revolution is baked into every democratic society. I mean, I think you can unpack that. My interpretation of that is simply, look, when people naturally feel aggrieved. This is a natural thing, and smarter people with power can tap into that and make use of it. I can tell you that if you vote for me, I'll tell you exactly what you want to hear and tell you that these other groups have marginalized you and that your lot in life, it has nothing to do with your family or you or your hard work or what your parents did, nothing to do with that. It's some other group. It's really easy to tap into. And it's unfortunately very easy to tap into in a Democrat society because, I mean, you can get 51% of the population to vote for the other 49% of the population to give you all of their stuff. You can tax the other 49%. And you can call that democracy, because hey, majority rules. That's another reason why we don't have a direct democracy. But I'll let you unpack that.
Well, and that's why America's republic, constitutional limited republic, is centered around the idea of the defense of the individual and the defense of individual rights. And so if you don't have that, if you don't have those hard guardrails in your society to say, we're not going to let people be criminals. We're not going to let people just do whatever they want in our cities. We're not going to let someone just come and steal our things. That those are what prevent the full-scale slide into a tyrannical system, a tyranny of the majority. By the way, the word Bolshevik in Russian literally means the majority. That's actually what it means, the majority. So we are the majority, even though, of course, by the way, if you look at the history of it, they at no point were they ever actually the majority.
But it's a propaganda technique.
We are the majority. Exactly. They claim we are the majority, and then Menshevik actually means minority. And so, but if they say we're on the side of the majority and the majority wants this is for the greater good, this is for the majority, then that is what we are going to do. By the way, just my other little translation trick is that the word communism or Chinese Communist Party in Mandarin, it actually means collective ownership. So the idea, so Gongchan Zhuyi. So Gong is public or collective. So collective ownership of property, collective control of property. And what is communism ultimately other than the complete abolition of private property? And so this idea that the collective will own everything, well, it's like, well, who's in charge of the collective? Well, we are. Of course we are, because we're the representatives of the collective.
Yeah, we represent the majority. The people love us.
Majority.
We tell them to. They love us. Just ask them. They're happy.
Propaganda tactics. Right. These propaganda
You're happy,
tactics
right?
and
You're happy, right?
That are always
You voted for me, right?
Continue until morale approves. Yeah, go ask the Venezuelans how happy they are under communism.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast.
Well,
there's bad.
That goes back to the fun line about you can vote your way into communism, but you can never vote your way out.
Oh, that's a good line. I'm not even sure I've heard that line, but yeah, there's the videos coming out from Venezuela are really disturbing. There was one that was actually kind of encouraging, where it was a bunch of police who just they're sobbing and they just start taking off their uniforms in protest, like we can't believe we're actually doing this, that we're actually stopping people from coming in to vote. That's again, that's a whole other podcast, because that's right in our hemisphere between Venezuela and Haiti. There's a lot that we are not paying attention. And Mexico, of course, is one of my big projects in Congress and the cartel task force. We are not paying nearly enough attention to what's happening in the Western Hemisphere. That's another podcast, and unfortunately, we don't have time. I could talk to you for 2 hours on this stuff, but I have to go.
The
And I
point
want to
is,
ask, and
I
I
was
want to
going.
ask
The
you a
point
couple more
is,
questions.
and we talked quite a bit about it, but it's this idea that what it's rooted in here is is pride, greed, these grievances that are endemic not just to societies, but to the human soul, to every human soul. Everyone's, had that experience where they grew up in a town and, they saw that house on
Yes,
the nice side of town that's
right.
gated and it's got the Bentleys going in, and people know what I'm talking about. And this idea, and so there's one way you can take that and say,
And they have bratty kids. They're just a
the
bunch of
kids
brats. They don't
suck,
deserve what they've
they
got. And
don't
it's
deserve
like, I
it.
need
Yep.
somebody to tell me that they don't deserve what they got, and I'm going to vote for
So
that person.
you could say, and what I teach my kids is, that's why we work hard. So we're going to work hard and we're going to better our lot in life, and we're going to find ways to get ahead, and we are going to work. That's why you work hard in school, and that's why you work hard at your job. You see dad works hard, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe we can have nice things as well one day. We've been very blessed, but and my wife grew up in the Soviet Union, by the way, so she did not grow up with the type of things that we have now. And we've taken them back to to visit her family's hometown to kind of see what what it was like. And so to your point, right? Yes, there's also that much easier path to take and to say, hey, you know what we should do to that family? We should go kill them and take their stuff, and then we'll have their stuff too. And this is the essential core element of all far left politics is those people don't deserve the things that they have, and we are going to take it from them.
You use a term that's very familiar to me. Haven't heard it really though since I left the Navy. And you being a former Navy intel guy, obviously you would use it. But you say that the Unhumans use, well, you say it's a verb, and which makes a lot more sense to me. So I'm saying it incorrectly. Anyway, what they do is leftists, Bolsheviks, communists, whatever. They use operational preparation of the environment, OPE.
Yes.
Talk about that. So that's a common concept in special operations.
Mhm.
But how do they use it in modern times to attain their goals?
So we break down operational preparation of the environment as, as a series of steps in a system whereby they prepare a society for a communist takeover or a push for a communist takeover. So, OPE in special operations, of course, is not society wide. It's usually for a particular operation, particular mission, but it's sort of similar. So this idea that you're preparing your battle space, you're preparing your environment by setting the conditions to allow for this to come about. So typically what we talk about here is mostly propaganda techniques, but then also infiltration of institutions, getting your people in key positions. So the chronic propaganda is one of them, identifying who your targets for the grievances would be. Now, in different countries, it might be different people. It might be the dynasty, it might be the regime, it might be, oh, I don't know, white Christian males, like in the United States and across the West. This is the group. This is the group that's the cause of all the trouble. And then you're constantly using propaganda and media and celebrities and politicians that are going against this one group over and over and over to the point where it just becomes or police officers, military, any institution that isn't in your direct control, the Supreme Court right now. And so there's constant propaganda, what we call chronic propaganda, that's used against them in general, and then acute propaganda when you want to run a specific operation. So an acute propaganda might be, the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation is evil. It's always been evil. When it's amazing to me how the Heritage Foundation has been completely demonized in the course of 6 weeks. It's not amazing, but it's also part of a system that in 6 weeks they've gone from being, kind of one of the more well-known mainstream conservative outlets and think tanks in Washington. They've been a mainstay in Washington for 50 years. They've got a huge building right across from Capitol Hill. And suddenly they're the boogeyman. Suddenly they are just the most evil thing in the entire world. Why? Because they can score political points by this. So in order for OPE to work for one of these acute operations like I'm talking about, you need to be sorting the environment, setting the stages, setting the conditions, and then when you find a target, a specific target, like the Heritage Foundation recently. Okay, we're going to target this one, and now everyone's going to converge on this target, and that's what you saw happen.
You have the
with
infrastructure
like
in
Project
place.
2025. Yes, setting up
Yeah,
the infrastructure.
that's the key word. It's like there's human and physical infrastructure. The human infrastructure is in placing the right people in the right places, getting them to believe the right thing. That takes time. That takes years. Physical infrastructure, perhaps not as important in the political sense, very important in the operational sense, what we mean, when we're conducting warfare. But it's funny because I have used the term OPE to describe politics. It's how you win an election too. I mean, it's like, well, Dan, how'd you win your first election when nobody knew you? It's like, well, I went back to my OPE training. Like I got to get, there's like two rules to winning an election. You got to get people to remember you and know you. So there's tactics to do that, and then there's getting them to kind of like you just a little bit more than the other guy, and boom, you've won an election. Let's talk about fighting back in our last few minutes. Like what can the common person who feels helpless about what they see, maybe the common college students, I don't know, what should we be focused on, and how should we do it?
Sure. So one of the main things that we talk about is that when you learn these different tactics, these OPE, for example, and by the way, I'll just say right off the bat that this book is not written for people who are political operators. This book is not written for your billionaires like your David Sachs and Elon Musk and everybody who's operating on that level. It's like I actually say that if you are at that level, then great, get in the fight. I'm more than happy to have you. But this book is written, and certainly it's accessible for anybody, but it's also written for, the soccer moms and the dads out there who are just saying, gosh, things don't seem to be going the way I want. And I don't have time to learn all this theory, but I'd like to do something to.
I want to be able to articulate it when I'm complaining about it. I want to be able to articulate it correctly. Yeah.
Right. And we even give a couple of things that we say small groups of men, small groups of women are really something that drives history all together throughout all of history that we found. Small groups of women, the moms groups out there, they're actually ahead of the dads right now, as a matter of fact, in terms of their activism. So it's counter activism to the Democrat activism. What do I mean by that? Think about things like, you may not have the ability to, start your own social media outlet or start your own TV network or whatever it is, but you've got a backyard and you've got a barbecue and you've got a group chat. And if you've got a school, so think of a small town, right? You've got a school board, you've got a Parks and Rec department, you've got a library. Well, guess what? A communist or a leftist will look at all of those as nodes of power in that town. That's why the school boards immediately get targeted, immediately getting taken over. And if you've ever been to a school board meeting, these are some of the most radical activists somehow get there. Why? Because, well, they may not be focused on higher learning or higher education. They are focused on power. And, conservatives will say, follow the money. With leftists, it's like, follow the power. Where can I get power? How can I attain power over your family? So they'll go straight for the school boards. Now, the school board thing has already taken off. It has a life of its own. I love it. That's why they're going after the Moms for Liberty so much. And, SPLC and other people have declared them extremists because they don't want pornography being presented to children in classrooms.
Yeah.
Just, so
they accuse us of like the banning the books, and it's like we're not banning books. We're just saying, yeah. I mean,
that's our response. Which books? Show me the book.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Show me how great this book is. That it's not exactly a classic. Anyway, but sorry to interrupt.
Another angle of another angle of intervention that we talk about is also just look at your local libraries. What's the name of your local librarian? What's the name of the head librarian there in that system, or your county, wherever you are? Because every library in this country, when you walk in at this point, public libraries, there's always that table, that first table that you see where it's got like anti-racist baby and it's got Kendi and it's got a children's book that's written by someone with the last name Obama, Clinton, or Biden. And or I guess Harris at this point now. And so they're all.
She can't write a book.
Why is that? Well, I think it's her. It's her niece. Her niece is the one who has the kids' book.
Yeah,
and,
no, I'm just saying
Maya
I can't imagine her actually
Maya
writing
Harris
books.
who is her sister. No, of course not. or read one for that matter. So it's Maya Harris is her younger sister, who was a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton, who has a daughter named Mina Harris, and Mina is the one who was writing these children's books, and I believe gotten a little bit of hot water with the original Kamala for President campaign back in like 2019 before she dropped out in early 2020, because she was putting out these children's books capitalizing on the family's notoriety and the fame.
Yeah, interesting.
But it wasn't really being authorized by the campaign, so they tried to get her to stop. So we'll see if that comes back around again. But the point being is, why is everyone's library like that? Well, it's because your leftist views that library as a node of power and as a node of being able to control and propagandize an area. So they'll target it. Why do they have Drag Queen Story Hour there? Well, because the leftists are there. Why are there pride parades everywhere? And why does your park have a drag queen story hour inside the park? Because they look at your parks and rec department as something like this. And so it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, that conservatives don't really look at institutions as things that we would want to go into. But we're not just talking about these national massive institutions. There are part-time institutions everywhere, just all over the place, that you can.
And they're probably more important
right now in your spare time. And honestly, in terms of great scale, if you get people to do that across I think there's 9,800 municipalities across the United States, that if you get people doing that across the municipalities all over the place, that's how you fight this stuff. Because look, it used to be localized to places like, Greenwich Village in New York or San Francisco. And we used to say, oh, well, that's just the San Francisco people. But then because of TikTok and because of the internet and really Tumblr, which is a whole longer conversation about how how a lot of this got started there, it's all spread out. And that's why you can go to schools in like Midwestern Nebraska or Ogallala or something, and you will find the exact same ideology being spread because they use social media and the internet. And so does that suck? Yeah, it does suck, right? I'd rather not have to be thinking about this stuff as well. But at the same time, I care about my children, I care about my family. And then on the next level, we also talk about this idea of reciprocity. If they're going to come after our guys with these chicken scratch investigations, then you know what? Turn the tables. You've got to find investigations against people like that. The 51 guys who signed this intel letter about Hunter Biden, was that an illegal in-kind donation? Well, if it was an illegal in-kind donation for Donald Trump, then maybe they should be investigated on the same terms. And none of this, and this is something that we find in the history, is that none of this stops on its own. None of this stops through debate. None of this stops because people say, "Oh, you know what? We got it wrong, guys. We totally realized that we screwed up there." No, none of it stops because of that. It stops because people, good people, patriotic people, believers, and Christians say enough is enough, and it's gone too far.
Yeah, and it's got to be done intelligently. I mean, there's a good way to fight back. It's like I said, the analogy of fire with fire versus fire with water. It's got to be done in a persuasive manner. We conservatives, for whatever reason that's maybe inexplicable, we're at a disadvantage when it comes to getting at that moderate segment of society for whatever reason. I don't know why. They just tend to view this is why Democrats can call us weird, and it actually works because for whatever reason, it's easier for them to convince the moderates, the swing voters, that we're weird, and it's harder for us to convince them otherwise. And I always put this out. It's like when you my suggestion
by the way, and a lot of that goes to the chronic propaganda that we've been talking about. So when you turn on Netflix, you know that you're going to be pushed with shows that have this in their media. If you go on, ESPN, if there's anything political that pops up, you know which side they're going to take. And again, it's just you're operating, and conservatives have to understand that you're operating in an environment and in a playing field that is dominated by the other side. They will always be able to set, at least currently, always be able to set the, quote unquote, what normal is. And that's why you have to fight back with truth. And honestly, we talk about humor a lot. We say it is the
humor's huge.
The bane of the leftist.
But also just being well informed on their tactics and their policy and knowing what the counter arguments are in a succinct and unemotional way will always serve you better and end up being more persuasive. I will say, after this conversation, Jack, I'm definitely much more interested in deep diving into your book. I don't say that about all book interviews I do, so I'm excited about it.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, it just sounds like there's some
storytelling in there.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And we went over a few things just in this conversation that I didn't know. So I look forward to going back into it. Thanks for being on. I'm sorry I got to run. But
No, that's all right.
this
I've
this
got
has
to
been
as well.
great. Hey, thanks for
Appreciate
being
it,
on, Jack,
Congressman.
and thanks for writing this, and talk soon.
As always.